Hello, friends, and welcome back to r/ProRevenge. And today we have 3 great stories, so let's get started. Neighbor extends driveway onto our property, admits fault, and does nothing. Note, in the province of Ontario, the only legal and recognized land surveyor is an Ontario Land Surveyor, OLS. Your brother-in-law, who knows how to work a transit, just isn't qualified. I moved from the Toronto area back up north in 2007. In 2008, we bought a home on a 4-acre forested lot from the original owner. Through conversations with the original owner, I remembered him muttering something about how the neighbor to the north had their driveway awful close to the property line. I thought no more about it until later that fall. Our neighbor's house was built slab on grade, and the builder must have messed up or not properly installed any drainage for the gravel pad. Every time it rained, they had water into their ground floor, an inconvenience to say the least. But not my problem. That is, until the neighbor rented an excavator and had a deep ditch dug all along our side of his driveway, dumping all of the rocks and spoil from the excavation onto our property. We also lost a number of trees, this all mature black maple sugar bush trees. I was getting concerned. We had problems with a jerk neighbor in Toronto and ended up having to get a survey and put up a fence. I wasn't going to lose any sleep worrying about it this time. Call for a surveyor, get this all over with. It turns out the OLS firm I called were the ones who surveyed the development when it was built 10 years earlier. They had no trouble mapping out how and where the neighbor's driveway for over 100 feet now arced up to 12 feet onto our property. Never mind the rocks and dirt in the bush beyond that. I sent a registered letter with a copy of the survey and a polite letter to our neighbor with registered you have to sign to pick it up. They received it but did not respond. I waited a month and sent another registered letter. That one wasn't picked up and was returned to me. Yeah, that should work. If I don't receive the letter, everything will just go away. In way of explanation, the neighbor was a successful local businessman, and in smaller communities, some of them tend to think that they're a bit special and can make their own rules. I learned from the jerk neighbor in Toronto that there's not much point to trying to discuss things personally. We have a system, let's use it. The next letter that's sent to them is from our real estate law firm. They know the right language to use and how to get someone's attention. Surprise! That one not only gets picked up, but we receive a letter from their lawyer. They freely admit that they're at fault and will make everything right. Except they don't. They don't do anything. For the next 3 years, absolutely nothing. I start receiving expert advice from some of my friends. SJK, you should fix it at your own cost and then sue them for that amount. Well, what if they claim they could have fixed it a lot cheaper, or I did a bunch of things that weren't needed? SJK, you should charge them for all the trees they cut down and make them replace them. Yeah, but we do live in a forest and the trees aren't really hard to find. In fact, we cut down trees that get too big, too close to our house. It's not like we're in the big city. I decide to do nothing. After the angst and sleepless nights with the jerks in Toronto, I decide to just wait it out. After all, they've admitted fault through their lawyer. It's not like they can wiggle out of that one or change their minds. I learned that the neighbor's wife hates living in the forest and would much rather have a schmancy house in town, and with the water problem that has never been resolved, it just isn't as much fun as they thought it would be. 4 years later, what I was waiting for, a realtor's for sale sign in front of their house. I stop and take a picture of the sign so that I have the phone number of the listing agent. I call them as soon as I get to work. Hi, this is SJK. I see you're listing a property at XXX. You may not be aware of this, but your client is trespassing on my property. Of course, the neighbor can't pretend this isn't true, and now we have to clean up the mess to our satisfaction before the property can be sold. Oh my. The 5-yard dump trucks ran for close to 3 weeks. They hauled load after load after load of topsoil. It all had to be dumped, spread out, and compacted. The gravel driveway had to be dug up and pulled back to the property line, and all that filled in as well. At the end, it was all seeded with the understanding it would eventually go back to being forest. SJK, is it okay now? Not quite yet. It looks like there's still a lot of work left to do. All the weeping tile, rocks, and piles of dirt were removed as well. Not an easily done job and very time-consuming. Don't get mad. Wait, then get even. Want to fail half the class because you lost our papers? Enjoy early retirement. So this happened during senior year in high school 4 years ago. I had an English teacher named Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith, or how she liked to refer to herself, Dr. Smith, she didn't have a doctorate, was a mean old bat that hated everything and anything. She was ugly inside and out. To give a mental image of what she looks like, her face sagged so much it looked like she had a perpetual stroke. She had about 2 feet in between her eyebrows and her eyes. Imagine Ursula and Cruella de Vil had a child, and then that child had a baby with the devil. You get Mrs. Smith. None of the other English teachers liked her. There was nothing that they nor the administration could do to her tenure. That is, until I became her student. Her teaching style included, but was not limited to, yelling at students, putting them down with petty insults, having us read to ourselves in the middle of class, kicking out students that were dozing off, then later fell asleep at her desk, not letting female students go to the restroom for very obvious reasons, and the occasional losing students' work, then accusing the students of not turning their work in. This last part is what crossed the line for me. You see, I wasn't a grade A student. I sucked at English. So I always played my cards right and made friends with everyone, students and teachers included. So when I struggled and couldn't do something on my own, I let my charm save me and cash out on my months of being nice to everyone. However, no one could be friends with Mrs. Smith. I tried being polite. I was met with rudeness. I tried asking her how her morning was. I was met with silence and dead stares. I tried asking how I could improve in my writing skills. She told me that she wasn't willing to help. Within the first week of class, I knew I had met my match. So halfway through the semester, we're working on a big research paper. However, the day after the due date, Mrs. Smith had to go up to Illinois for some family issues for 2 weeks. Mind you, we turned in our papers both in hand and on Turnitin.com for plagiarism checking. No biggie, we won't get our grades back for a while, but at least we won't have to deal with her BS. Or so we thought. A few days later, after she gets back, only about half the students got their papers back. The other half, including myself, were sitting there staring and waiting, thinking that she was going to go back to her desk and pull out the remaining papers to return to her students. But nope, she told us to take out our textbooks and start reading Beowulf. Some students, including myself, that didn't receive their papers tried to interject and inquire about our papers, and she snapped back with, "You should have turned them in when they were due." In unison, we respond with, "We did." Of course, she denies it, and within a few days, our grades drop immensely. At the end of the grading period, second 6 weeks, our report cards show big, fat Fs for English. You were moved to a lower level English at the end of the semester. Between the 0 from the paper that carried almost half of our grade and only a few weeks remaining in the semester, almost half the class was doomed to fail out. Now, most of the students were happy with having to leave her class. There was not much they could do, but I was careful. Remember the teaching methods I mentioned above? Well, Mrs. Smith thought that because we were in a classroom that had no cameras, her behavior wasn't being recorded. She was dead wrong. From the second week on, I started recording audio on my phone every day from the moment I walked into the class to the moment I left. Every day. I caught every single one of her personal attacks on students on tape. When she fell asleep, I pulled out my phone and recorded her. My pleas for help to improve and her refusal to help weren't left out either. Every day I would go home, cut the audio to keep the good parts, and every day my collection of dirt on her grew. And remember how I said we used Turnitin.com as well as paper? I had coordinated with all of the other students who were going to fail to screenshot all of their Turnitin receipts and send them to me as proof that they turned in their work. When she decided to fail me for her mistake, she unleashed hell on herself. I went straight to the administration and scheduled a parent-teacher admin conference. A week later, my parents, the principal, the school counselor, the head of the English department, and Mrs. Smith were all present. I started with how she had lost half of the class's work and how most of us failed because of it. She denied it and again accused us of turning in our work late, as well as cheating and a bunch of other BS and lies. I remained calm and just pulled out a folder that contained all of the screenshots from my backpack and handed it to the principal, who then passed it to the head of the English department, who then asked Mrs. Smith to explain it. She instantly turned red in the face and started stuttering. Before she could get out any words, I say, "That's not all. Listen to this." I pull out my phone and start playing back the highlights from the semester. All the while, I'm staring dead into Mrs. Smith's eyes while trying to hold back a crap-eating grin. The suspense in the room would have killed Jason Statham. After the audio finished, the principal looked at me and said, "I think we've seen enough," and asked me to leave. I sat outside of the conference room, savoring the muffled yelling through the walls. I'm pretty sure I heard my dad utter the words, "filthy C-word," but I don't want to point fingers. The parent-teacher conference was on a Friday. I walked into class the following Monday to see an empty desk and a substitute teacher we all recognized and loved. 10 for 10 would document everything again. Well, you were warned not to park there. This story happened about 15 years ago, give or take. At the time, I worked for a small industrial railroad in my city that served about 20 different industries along the docks. To get to the docks from the yard where I would pick up the inbound, deliveries to the industries, cars, we had a mile of street trackage that ran right down the middle of a small street. Numerous bars lined the street on one side with the river on the other side. Because of city regulations, we were only allowed to operate along that span of tracks between specific hours, typically 11 at night to about 5 in the morning. However, since the bars were open at that time, it also meant that we had to trundle along at a crawl, usually walking pace or just above that, and keep the locomotive on the front end of the movement. Every night I went down that street, there would typically be 2 or 3 people who'd parked too close to the tracks, prompting me to have to get people to move their cars. It wasn't a major problem, just an annoyance. Except for one guy. It seemed that every single night I would have to stop about halfway down because this guy would always park his truck at an angle in the street as opposed to parallel parking. There were some angle parking spaces nearby, but they were further down where there weren't any rails in the road. Every single night, I'd have to head into the bar this guy owned and bug the guy to get him to move the truck. Most of the time, it'd take him a good 30 minutes to an hour to drag himself out and move the thing. This meant, of course, I was losing time that I needed to get my job done. After months of this, I finally decided that I had had enough, so I decided to have the guy towed. Yeah, that didn't work out as well as I hoped. Turned out the guy also had some job with the city or the mayor's office or some friend in either, so no one would dare come out and tow his truck. I think I waited there a good hour before he eventually came out and moved it, even having the gall to flip me the bird as he left. At that point, I decided that not only was I totally done with the guy, but if the chance arose, I was going to teach him a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. Nothing physical per se, just a hard-earned lesson. A couple days later, I found myself heading down the track with a half a dozen heavy cars with machinery bound for the docks. As I rounded the curve and neared the place where that guy always parked, I gently applied the independent brakes on the locomotive. This would slow the heavy train, but wasn't enough to stop it outright, at least not quickly. I waited until the very last minute, laying on the horn and applying the full brakes, bringing everything to a screeching halt in the middle of the street. As I felt the brakes begin to hold, there was this loud thunk and screeching and tearing of metal as the train simply punted the truck out of the way, tearing the bed clean off in the process. This did not go unnoticed, as a crowd had started to gather out front of the bar when they heard the train coming. I stay in the cab, calling back to dispatch, and informed them that I'd struck a parked car and they needed to get the police and a tow truck out to my location. All the while, I could hear the guy screaming. Heard him over the sound of the locomotive, no less, at the top of his lungs about how he was going to have me thrown in jail, sue the company, and all manner of things. Locking the doors, I opted to just wait in the cab for the boys in blue to arrive. Eventually, they pop around and start taking statements. I explained the problem, noting that I couldn't, well, I could have, but I wouldn't have been a good idea, simply slam on the brakes due to the cargo I was carrying, and that the only reason I hit the truck was because it was improperly parked. I added that the gentleman had been warned in the past that something like this could happen and had ignored the warnings. The man, for his part, was simply livid, hopping around, yelling at me, yelling at the cops, and just beside himself. In the end, he was ticketed for his bad parking, obstructing the passage of a train, and his truck was totaled. And he ended up on the hook for paying for it. Truck was brand new and not yet paid off, or so I was told. It took about 2 hours to clean up the mess, and I was, per company rules, suspended for a week during the company investigation, but honestly, it was worth it. Didn't have any problems with him from that point forward either. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon.